Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku's quirk let him pause time, but only while bleeding. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world, for 10-year-old Izuku Midoriya, was a symphony of glorious noise. It was the thunderous boom of a hero landing, the crackle of a villain's ill-conceived quirk, the roar of a grateful crowd. Above all, it was the booming, declarative laugh of All Might, a sound that promised safety, a sound that was the very anthem of hope. Izuku lived for that noise. He chased it through news reports, through online forums, through the very streets of Muzidafu, his worn-out notebook clutched in his hand like a holy text. He catalogued it all. The mechanics of quirks, their applications, their presumed weaknesses. He drew heroes with a dedicated, if clumsy, hand, annotating their costumes, their catchphrases, their signature moves. It was his obsession, his religion. But there was another, quieter, more private catalog he kept, one not written in any notebook. It had started with a scraped knee after a particularly nasty trip courtesy of Katsuki Bakugo and his cronies. While other kids would have cried and run to a teacher, Izuku had limped to the school nurse's office, utterly fascinated. He watched, rapt, as she cleaned the wound. He noted the precise way she applied the antiseptic, the careful stretching of the adhesive bandage. He felt the sting, the initial rush of blood, and then the strange, dull ache of the body beginning its silent, miraculous work of mending. From then on, his fascination took a strange, slightly morbid turn. His bedroom, a shrine to All Might, began to accumulate other, less heroic paraphernalia. Tucked away on his bookshelf, between All Might, a pictorial history and quirk manifestations of the modern age, were anatomy charts meant for high school students. He had a dog-eared copy of a basic first aid manual and had spent his allowance on a surprisingly comprehensive paramedics kit, complete with various types of bandages, sterile gauze, medical tape, and antiseptic wipes. His mother, Inko, thought it was an extension of his hero worship. "You want to know how to help people who get hurt, don't you, sweetie?" she'd said, her smile watery with a familiar mix of pride and pity for her quirkless son. Izuku had just nodded, unable to articulate the truth. It wasn't just about helping others. It was about understanding the machine. The human body was the one thing everyone had in common, the canvas upon which the wild, chaotic art of quirks was painted. He studied how muscles contracted, how bones could break and knit, how much blood a person could lose before things became critical. He saw the physical toll of heroism. He'd watch Endeavor on TV and wonder about the strain on his circulatory system from constantly generating such intense heat. He saw Empty Lady and calculated the sheer caloric intake she must require to sustain her transformations. To him, quirks weren't just magic. They were biology, pushed to its absolute limit, and biology was fragile. Biology could be broken. His own body was a testament to that fragility. He was small, scrawny, and his skin was a road map of minor injuries from a childhood spent as a target. Each scrape, each bruise, was a lesson. He learned to clean and dress his own wounds with a clinical precision that unnerved the school nurse. Bakugo would shove him, and Izuku would fall, but his first thought wasn't the humiliation. It was an immediate, internal assessment. Scraped palm. Minor bleeding. Probability of infection low if cleaned within the hour. It was a coping mechanism, a way to exert some small measure of control in a life where he felt he had none. Bakugo, of course, saw this strange detachment as another form of weakness. "What's the matter, Deku?" he'd sneer, after knocking Izuku's books from his hands. "Gonna go patch yourself up like a little doll? It's pathetic. You can't even get hurt right." Izuku never had a good response. He would just gather his things, his gaze lingering on a fresh scratch on his hand, the tiny welling of red, a point of intense focus in a world that was otherwise blurry with tears he refused to let fall. He was Deku. The useless one. The one who could only study the game, never play it. He was a spectator in a world of superhumans, his face pressed against the glass, his only contribution a meticulous analysis of the players inside. That particular afternoon was sticky and hot, the kind of summer day that made the asphalt soft. School had just let out, and Izuku was taking his usual route home, one that deliberately avoided the path Bakugo and his friends took. He was rereading his notes on the pro-hero Kamui Woods, muttering to himself about the potential vulnerability of his arboreal limbs to fire-based attacks, when he heard it. A clang, a roar, and a slimy, wet series of thuds from the underpass ahead. His blood ran cold. Villain. He peeked around the corner, heart hammering against his ribs. A monstrous creature made of green, viscous sludge was erupting from a manhole cover, its forms shifting and bubbling. And then, a sound that eclipsed all fear, a sound that was pure, distilled joy. Have no fear! From the opposite side of the underpass, a figure shot out like a cannonball, impossibly large and radiating an aura of pure power. All Might. In the flesh. It was like seeing the sun rise for the first time. For I am here. Izuku fumbled for his notebook, his hands shaking too much to even uncap his pen. All Might moved in a blur of red, white, and blue. Texas Smash, he bellowed, and the force of his punch alone seemed to pressurize the air in the tunnel, splattering the sludge villain into 1,000 gooey droplets. With practiced efficiency, All Might began scooping the residue into a pair of empty soda bottles. Izuku was paralyzed by awe. It was everything he'd ever dreamed of. The power, the confidence, the effortless victory. All Might turned, about to leap away, and Izuku's legs finally unlocked. He had to ask. He had to know. The desperate, foolish hope that had been his constant companion for 6 years surged within him. He ran, latched onto All Might's leg just as the hero took off, and found himself soaring through the sky in a terrifying, exhilarating rush. The conversation on the rooftop was a blur of crushing disappointment. The words echoed in his head, a death knell for his lifelong dream. Can someone without a quirk become a hero like you? It's not wrong to dream. However, you need to be realistic, young man. All Might, his idol, his god, had left him there, a shrunken, pathetic figure on a rooftop, the cold wind whipping away the last embers of his hope. He trudged down the stairs, the world drained of its color, the symphony of heroism replaced by a dull, monotonous drone. Quirkless. It was a brand, a final, unchangeable verdict. He was so lost in his despair that he almost didn't notice the commotion. A crowd had gathered at the end of the street, their phones held high. Smoke billowed into the sky. An explosion, sharp and angry, punctuated the air. It was a sound he knew intimately. Nitroglycerin sweat. Kaken. Izuku pushed his way through the crowd, a cold dread washing over him. The scene was chaos. The sludge villain, the same one All Might had bottled up, was back. And it had a hostage. A thrashing, furious hostage with spiky blonde hair, whose desperate, panicked explosions were only setting the surrounding buildings on fire. Bakugo. The heroes were there, Kamui Woods, Death Arms, the rookie Empty Lady, but they were helpless. Kamui was weak to fire. Death Arms couldn't get a grip. Empty Lady didn't have room to maneuver. They were waiting for someone with the right quirk. Izuku watched, frozen. He saw Bakugo's eyes. For the first time in his life, he didn't see the arrogant bully, the confident rival. He saw raw, undiluted terror. He saw a kid drowning. Bakugo's eyes met his for a split second, and in that gaze was a desperate plea for help. Something inside Izuku snapped. He didn't think. There was no plan, no analysis. His notebook fell from his limp hand, forgotten. His legs, which had felt like lead moments before, were moving. He was running, pushing past the barricades, ignoring the shouts of the pro-heroes. Get back here, you idiot! You'll get yourself killed. The world narrowed to a tunnel. At the end of it was Bakugo, his struggles growing weaker. The villain's slimy body churned, a grotesque mockery of life. Its massive, liquid arms swung wildly, knocking over a street lamp. The metal poles slammed against the side of a delivery truck, shearing off a piece of the truck's side paneling, a jagged, twisted piece of steel, sharp as a razor's edge. The villain thrashed again, and the piece of metal was sent spinning through the air like a deadly discus. Izuku was still running, his mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated instinct. He didn't even see it coming. He just felt it. A white-hot, searing line of agony tore through his left forearm. The impact was strong enough to make him stumble, his sneakers squealing on the pavement. He looked down. A deep, obscene gash ran from his wrist to his elbow. Blood darker than he could have imagined, welled up instantly, thick and hot. It overflowed the banks of the wound, spilling down his arm, dripping from his fingertips onto the gray asphalt in fat, crimson drops. The pain was immense, a fire that consumed his entire being. He opened his mouth to scream, and the world stopped. It wasn't a slowdown. It was an instantaneous, absolute cessation. The roar of Bakugo's explosions, the crackle of the flames, the frantic shouts of the crowd and heroes, the villain's gurgling hiss, all of it vanished. The symphony of chaos was replaced by a profound, deafening silence. The only sound was a faint, high-pitched ringing in his ears, the ghost of noise. His eyes, wide with shock and pain, took in the scene. The world had been bled of its color. Everything was cast in a million shades of gray, like an old photograph. The flames licking the side of a storefront were frozen solid, their tendrils like delicate, orange-tinted glass sculptures. A cascade of sparks from one of Bakugo's explosions hung in the air, a static cloud of tiny, brilliant diamonds. The sludge villain was a stationary monstrosity, its surface unmoving, a single, grotesque bubble paused halfway to bursting. And Bakugo. Bakugo was a statue of horror. His face, contorted in a silent scream, was locked in place. A single tear was frozen on his cheek, a perfect, crystalline bead. The suffocating sludge was wrapped tight around him, unyielding. Izuku stood in the middle of it all, the sole point of color and motion in a dead, monochrome world. He looked at his arm. The blood was still flowing, a vibrant, shocking river of red against his pale, gray-toned skin. He could feel his heart hammering, a frantic drumbeat in the silent expanse. He could feel the throb of his wound, a rhythmic pulse of agony that was achingly, terrifyingly real. What? He whispered, and his own voice sounded alien, a jarring intrusion in the stillness. He took a hesitant step. The world remained frozen. He waved a trembling hand in front of his face. It moved. He was moving. Nothing else was. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. Was he dead? Was this the afterlife? A single, silent moment of his greatest failure, stretched into eternity? No, he could feel the pain. He could feel the warm, sticky blood coating his skin. Pain was for the living. His gaze fell again from his bleeding arm to the frozen form of Bakugo. The connection clicked into place, a horrifying equation solving itself in his mind. The cut. The blood. The stillness. The world had stopped because he was bleeding. He didn't know how. He didn't know why. There was no time for that. There was only the evidence before him and the silent, screaming face of his childhood friend. The adrenaline, which had propelled him into the street, surged anew, sharpened by a terrifying, newfound purpose. He couldn't fight the villain. He was just a quirkless, no, not quirkless. He was a boy with a gushing wound and a handful of stolen seconds. He stumbled forward, his run clumsy and awkward on legs that felt both leaden and light. The silent world was unnerving. He passed the frozen pro-hero, Death Arms, his fist cocked back in a useless gesture. He ran past the crowd of onlookers, their faces a gallery of frozen shock and morbid curiosity. Each step was an eternity. The only things that changed were his own ragged breathing, the ever-present throb in his arm, and the steady drip, drip, drip of his blood onto the street. He reached the base of the sludge monster. It was like standing before a mountain of cold, foul-smelling jelly. He could see Bakugo's face clearly, his eyes wide and vacant, his mouth forced open by the viscous fluid. He was suffocating. Even in this frozen moment, he was dying. Anatomy charts. First aid manuals. The strange knowledge he'd accumulated suddenly felt less like a morbid hobby and more like a lifeline. Asphyxiation, airway must be cleared. His hands, slick with his own blood, clawed at the semi-solid sludge covering Bakugo's mouth and nose. It was thick, resistant, and horribly cold. It was like digging through refrigerated tar. He scrabbled at it, his fingers sinking into the grotesque mass. He pulled, grunting with effort, the sound swallowed by the immense silence. A chunk came loose. He flung it aside, where it hung, suspended in the air a foot away. He dug again, frantic now, a desperate, primal part of his brain screaming at him. He could feel a lightheadedness creeping in, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. The blood loss. His internal catalog flashed a warning. Deep laceration on forearm, significant blood flow, risk of hypovolemic shock. He ignored it. He had to. He clawed away another handful of the sludge, and then another, until finally, he had carved a small pocket of air around Bakugo's nose and mouth. It wasn't much, but it was an airway. It was a chance. Just as he pulled his hands away, a wave of dizziness washed over him. His vision swam. He looked down at his arm. The initial gush of blood was slowing. The body, that miraculous machine, was already trying to save itself. Platelets were activating, fibrin was forming a mesh. The bleeding was starting to clot. As the flow of red trickled to a slow ooze, the world shuddered. It wasn't a smooth transition. It was a violent, jarring lurch. A single, deafening groan, as if the universe itself was in pain. The color flooded back in a dizzying wave. The sound crashed down on him like a physical blow, the roar of fire, the crackle of explosions, the screams of the crowd, all resuming in the exact instant they had stopped. The sludge monster jolted, its frozen form reanimating. Bakugo, his airway now miraculously clear, coughed violently, sucking in a ragged, desperate breath of air. What the? The villain gurgled, confused by the sudden change. Izuku was on his knees, gasping, the world spinning around him. His arms screamed in agony. The sudden return of sound and motion was disorienting, nauseating. He had done it. He had saved him, but no one had seen. To everyone else, it was an impossible, inexplicable moment. 1 second, Bakugo was suffocating. The next, he was breathing. The villain, enraged by its captive's resistance, raised a massive pseudopod to crush the small, bleeding boy before it. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the impact. He had nothing left. He was spent. I really am pathetic. The voice, thick with self-recrimination, boomed through the chaos. Izuku opened his eyes. All Might stood between him and the villain, his jacket torn, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. I preached the tenets of heroism, yet I failed to live by them. All Might declared, his presence alone seeming to push back the flames. He grabbed Izuku's and Bakugo's arms, his grip impossibly strong. Pros are always risking their lives. That's the true test of a hero. He planted his feet. Detroit. Smash! The punch that followed was more than a punch. It was a weather event. The air pressure shifted so violently that the sludge villain was blasted apart, its essence scattered to the four winds. The very sky seemed to obey, clouds swirling and gathering until, moments later, rain began to fall, extinguishing the fires and washing the grime from the street. The aftermath was a haze. Izuku was on the ground, the cool rain mixing with the hot blood on his arm. The pro-heroes were there, first scolding him for his recklessness, then awkwardly praising him after All Might explained the situation from his perspective. Izuku barely heard them. His mind was elsewhere. He was shivering, whether from the rain or the blood loss, he couldn't tell. A paramedic finally reached him, their face a mask of professional concern. My God, kid, that's a nasty one. Let's get that wrapped up. They worked quickly, cleaning the wound with an antiseptic that stung fiercely, wrapping it in thick layers of white gauze. Through the fog of his exhaustion, he saw Bakugo being checked over by another medic. He was alive. He was breathing. He was glaring at Izuku with a look of pure, unadulterated confusion and rage. Later, walking home on trembling legs, the bandage on his arm a stark white beacon, Izuku replayed the moment 1,000 times. The world stopped. He moved. He saved Kaken. It wasn't a dream. The deep, throbbing ache in his arm was proof of that. He stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, the evening lights of the city blurring around him. He slowly, deliberately, unwrapped a corner of the gauze. The wound was angry and red, stitched together by the paramedic's medical glue. He stared at it, the instrument of his impossible act. His whole life, he had cried and prayed and wished for a quirk. He had dreamed of developing telekinesis, or super strength, or pyrokinesis, something flashy, something heroic, something like All Might's. He had been so consumed with what he didn't have that he never considered what form his power might actually take. He looked from his wounded arm to the memory of Bakugo's terrified face, now safe. The equation was simple, stark, and utterly horrifying. To gain time, he had to give blood. To be the hero he always wanted to be, to win, to save people from the jaws of death, he would have to sacrifice pieces of himself. Again and again and again, a single, hysterical laugh escaped his lips, quickly turning into a sob. He had a quirk. He finally had a quirk, and it was going to destroy him. The 10 months that followed the sludge villain incident were a secret, silent apprenticeship in the art of self-destruction. The world saw a boy engaged in a Herculean effort of physical transformation. They saw Izuka Midoriya hauling refrigerators across the sands of Dagoba Municipal Beach Park, his thin frame slowly hardening into something more resilient. They saw All Might, in his skeletal, coughing form, directing the boy with gruff encouragement, pushing him to build a body worthy of becoming a vessel. But they only saw half of the story. The more significant training happened in the dead of night, in the solitary confines of Izuka's bedroom, under the watchful, smiling gaze of an All Might poster that now felt like an accusation. It began a week after the incident. The gash on his arm had scabbed over, a vicious, angry zipper on his skin. The memory of the stillness, however, was a fresh wound, one that wouldn't close. He had to know if it was real, if he could control it. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs as he sat at his desk, the rest of the apartment silent and dark. His mother was asleep. The only light came from his desk lamp, illuminating a small square of his workspace. On it lay a single, innocuous thumbtack he'd pulled from his corkboard. Its plastic head was a cheerful yellow, its point a tiny, silver glint of promise and terror. This was different. This wasn't an accident. This was a choice. His hand trembled as he picked it up. His gaze flickered to the anatomy charts on his wall, his eyes tracing the network of capillaries in the human hand. A hero saves people. This was what he had to do to become one. The thought was a shield against the rising tide of fear and self-preservation. He took a deep, shuddering breath, pressed the point of the thumbtack against the fleshy pad of his left index finger, and pushed. The pain was sharp but small, a tiny starburst of sensation. It was immediately followed by a welling of blood, a perfect, crimson bead. And just as the blood broke the surface of his skin, the world fell away. Silence. Absolute. The hum of his computer fan, the distant rumble of a late-night train, the ticking of the clock on his wall, all gone. The world beyond his window was a still life in shades of gray. A leaf, caught in its descent from a tree, hung suspended in the air. The blinking light of a distant radio tower was frozen mid-blink, a single, unwavering point of red. He was inside the photograph again. He looked at his hands. His right hand, holding the thumbtack, was still. His left hand, with its single, glistening drop of blood, was also still. But he could move. He willed his right hand to move, and it did, pulling the thumbtack away. He was the ghost in the machine. The moment he removed the tack, the pressure on the wound ceased. The tiny puncture began to seal itself almost instantly, and with the cessation of bleeding, time crashed back into existence with a physical jolt. The computer hummed, the clock ticked, the world outside resumed its motion. The entire experience had lasted for less than a second. A single, stolen heartbeat, a giddy, terrifying wave of triumph and nausea washed over him. He could do it. He could control it. That first night was the beginning of his true training. He became a grim scientist of his own physiology. He procured a digital stopwatch and a small, leather-bound notebook, not for hero analysis, but for a darker purpose. He filled its pages with meticulous, coded entries. Entry 1: thumbtack, index finger. Pressure light. Result: 0.8 seconds. Sensation: minimal pain. Entry 3: sewing needle, back of hand. Depth: 1 mm. Result: 1.2 seconds. Sensation: sharp sting, easily ignored. Entry 7: safety pin, thigh. Depth: 2 mm. Result: 2.1 seconds. Sensation: lingering ache. He learned the grim calculus of his quirk. Duration was directly proportional to the rate and volume of blood flow. A shallow scratch that bled slowly gave him a flicker of stillness, a staccato burst just long enough to perceive the world as a series of frozen frames. A deeper cut, something that severed a more significant vessel, bought him precious, uninterrupted seconds. His mother, Inko, grew worried. She saw her son, once so frail, becoming stronger, his muscles gaining definition from his training with Yagi-san, the skeletal man he introduced as a personal trainer. But she also saw the other things. The small, unexplained bandages that would appear on his hands and legs. The way he would sometimes flinch if she grabbed his arm too quickly. The haunted, distant look that would occasionally cloud his eyes. "Izuku, honey, what happened here?" she asked one evening, her gentle fingers tracing a fresh bandage on his forearm. "Oh. That?" He pulled his arm back, his heart skipping a beat. "Just training. Tripped over some rebar at the beach. You know how clumsy I am." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He was building a wall between them, brick by painful brick, to protect her from the horrifying nature of his power. He hated it, but he saw no other way. His first aid kit, once a morbid hobby, became his most essential tool. He upgraded from a simple utility knife, which was too crude and prone to causing ragged, hard-to-heal wounds, to a set of scalpels he ordered online from a medical supply company. They were sterile, brutally sharp, and allowed for clean, precise incisions that bled freely but could be closed and healed with minimal scarring. He learned to be an expert in his own care, cleaning and dressing his wounds with a detached, clinical efficiency that would have chilled a seasoned doctor to the bone. His physical training at the beach took on a new, desperate urgency. All Might pushed him to build muscle, to become a worthy vessel for One for All, a secret Izuku wasn't yet privy to. But for Izuku, every push-up, every grueling run hauling scrap metal, was about more than just strength. He needed to be fast enough to capitalize on the few seconds his quirk afforded him. He needed to have the stamina to function while lightheaded from blood loss. He was forging his body into a weapon, and simultaneously learning how to break it in the most effective way possible. The 10 months passed in a blur of sweat, pain, and secrets. The beach was clean, his body was honed, and his mind was a fortress of grim resolve. He stood before the towering gates of UA, high, a sea of confident, chattering teenagers around him, and felt a profound sense of alienation. They were all here to show off their spectacular gifts. He was here to hide his. His quirk wasn't a dazzling display of power, it was a quiet, bloody transaction, performed in the shadows. In his pocket, wrapped in a sterile wipe inside a small plastic case, was a single, razor-sharp scalpel blade. The price of admission. The written exam was a formality, a simple test of academics he passed with ease. It was the practical exam that loomed like a tidal wave. He stood in his tracksuit at the gates of Battle Center B, the massive, sprawling cityscape, a monument to the kind of heroism he felt was forever out of his reach. Present Mick's voice boomed from the watchtowers. "And begin!" The massive gates slid open, and the other examinees shot forward in a blur of motion. A boy with engines in his legs blasted past. A girl with pink skin skated ahead on a trail of acid. Izuku was left standing in the dust, his heart pounding a nervous tattoo. What are you waiting for? The real battle doesn't wait for a countdown. Go! 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 Izuku jolted into a run, his mind racing. His strategy was radically different from everyone else's. He wasn't a warrior, he was a surgeon. He couldn't smash the robots into submission. A one-pointer, a squat, green machine on tank treads, rolled around a corner and locked onto him. Its red eye glowed. Izuku dodged behind a building, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He couldn't fight it head-on. He was a scavenger, a creature of opportunity. He spent the first few minutes running, dodging and observing. He saw the other examinees in action, their quirks a vibrant, destructive ballet. Bakugo was a whirlwind of explosions, effortlessly racking up points. Izuku felt a familiar pang of uselessness. He had 0 points. He was failing. Then he saw her, the girl with the round, kind face from the orientation. The one he'd stopped from tripping. Ochako Uraraka. She was fighting a two-pointer, making the robot float with her quirk, but she was struggling. As she released it, it crashed to the ground, and she stumbled backward, breathing heavily. She didn't see the shadow that fell over her. Izuku saw it. He saw it all. The ground was shaking. From behind a skyscraper, the 0-pointer emerged. It was a titan of metal and wiring, a colossus that dwarfed the surrounding buildings. Its tread was as wide as a bus, and its single, massive arm swung down, casting a wave of shattered concrete and debris. Uraraka screamed, trapped beneath a large slab of concrete pinning her leg. The robot's massive form lumbered toward her, slow, inexorable, and utterly unstoppable. The other examinees were fleeing, their faces pale with terror. It's the zero-pointer. It's worth nothing. Run! Izuku stood frozen, 50 yards away. The heroes in a real situation wouldn't run. All Might wouldn't run. His hand went to his pocket. The hesitation lasted only a second. He saw her terrified face, the tears welling in her eyes, and his resolve hardened into diamond. He pulled out the scalpel blade, palming it so no one could see. With a practiced, fluid motion born of hundreds of secret rehearsals, he drew the blade swiftly across the palm of his left hand. The cut was deep, a clean, straight line. The pain was a familiar, grounding shock. Blood welled instantly, rich and dark, and spilled over his fingers. The world died. The thunderous grinding of the zero-pointer, the panic screams, the crumbling of buildings, all vanished into absolute, profound silence. The monstrous robot was a frozen statue, its fist descending in a gesture of imminent destruction. The cloud of dust and debris kicked up by its advance hung in the air, a complex, three-dimensional sculpture of chaos. Uraraka was a perfect portrait of fear, her mouth open in a silent scream, her body trapped. Izuku didn't waste a fraction of a second. This was a deep cut. He had maybe 7, 8 seconds. Go, he ran. The air felt thick and heavy, like running through water, but his body, honed by 10 months of relentless training, responded. He was a blur of green and white against the gray, static world. He reached Uraraka's side. In the stillness, he could assess the situation with perfect clarity. The concrete slab was too heavy to move. But he didn't need to move it. He just needed to move her. He grabbed her under the arms. Her body was stiff and unyielding, like a mannequin. He grunted with the effort, the sound loud in the silent world, and pulled. She slid out from under the slab, her trapped leg freed. He dragged her a few feet away, out of the direct path of the robot's fist. 4 seconds left. He could feel the dizziness starting, the telltale sign of his time running out as his body tried to stem the bleeding. He looked up at the giant robot. Just saving her wasn't enough. He had to think like a hero. He had to neutralize the threat. His eyes scanned the frozen debris field and spotted it. A long, thick piece of rebar, bent into a hook. An idea, born of his analytical mind, sparked. He grabbed it. It was heavy, but manageable. He looked at the robot's ankle joint, a complex mess of exposed pistons and gears. 2 seconds. He scrambled over, shoving the end of the rebar deep into the robot's ankle mechanism, wedging it between 2 massive, frozen gears. It was a desperate, long-shot act of sabotage. His vision was starting to tunnel. The world at the periphery of his sight was darkening. The bleeding was slowing. He stumbled back, his palm pressed against his leg to staunch the flow. He released his Quirk's trigger. Time, sound, and color crashed back into reality with a sickening lurch. The zero-pointer's fist slammed into the ground exactly where Uraraka had been, pulverizing the concrete slab. A shockwave threw Izuku off his feet. The robot tried to take another step, but its ankle locked. The rebar, now caught in the moving gears, twisted and screeched. With a groan of protesting metal, the massive machine faltered, its leg buckling. It tilted unbalanced, and crashed sideways into a building, its red eye flickering and dying. Uraraka, now conscious of her freedom, stared in shock from the crater to the toppled behemoth, then to Izuku, who was staggering to his feet, clutching a hand that was now slick with blood. How did you? She started, but Izuku was already moving. He couldn't stay. He couldn't explain. He spent the rest of the exam as a ghost. He didn't seek out fights. He listened for cries for help. A student was cornered by 2 three-pointers. Izuku, tripping over some rubble, scraped his knee badly. In the 3 seconds of stillness that followed, he ran, grabbed a loose pipe, and wedged it between the 2 robots, causing them to collide and short-circuit when time resumed. Another examinee was about to be blasted by a 2-pointer's laser cannon. Izuku, hidden behind a car, used his blade for a tiny, quick jab to his own thigh. The 1.5-second pause was just enough for him to throw a rock at the robot's optical sensor. Time resumed. The rock hit its mark. The laser blast went wide, harmlessly striking the wall. It was a grueling, bloody performance. Each act of heroism cost him a piece of himself. He was becoming a patchwork of minor, strategically inflicted wounds. He disabled 3 more robots and saved 2 more examinees, never earning a single villain point. He was a phantom, his impossible speed and timely interventions leaving a trail of bewildered students in his wake. When the final buzzer blared, signaling the end of the exam, Izuku was leaning against the wall, panting. He was pale, dizzy, and his body was a symphony of aches and stings. He looked at his hands, his legs. He was covered in scrapes, cuts, and bruises. The price had been paid. He looked at the scoreboard in the distance. 0. The number mocked him. He had saved people. He had acted like a hero, but by the rules of the exam, he had failed utterly. A wave of despair washed over him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. In a darkened observation room high above the battle centers, a bank of monitors displayed feeds from every corner of the exam sites. The UA faculty watched with discerning eyes. Whoa, check out that kid with the explosions. He's racking up the points. A real dynamo. President Mike yelled, pointing at a screen showing Bakugo. Indeed, Principal Niza said, his paws steepled before him. A powerful and straightforward Quirk. But not the most interesting one today. He tapped a button, and the main screen switched to a series of clips focusing on a certain green-haired boy. The first clip showed the zero-pointer incident. This kid, Midoriya Izuku, Niza mused. His record says he's quirkless. On the screen, Izuku ran toward Uraraka. There was a slight, almost imperceptible stutter in the video feed, a single frame where Izuku was suddenly closer than he should have been. Then he was a blur, moving with a speed that defied physics. He's not quirkless, a tired, gravelly voice cut in. All eyes turned to Shota Aizawa, his face wrapped in his signature scarf. He looked bored, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Rewind that. Slow it down to 100th speed. The footage replayed in painstaking slow motion. They saw Izuku running. They saw his hand move. They saw the glint of something sharp. They saw the blood. And then, for a single frame, the camera feed registered a massive data error, a temporal anomaly, before correcting itself. In the next coherent frame, Uraraka was several feet away, and Izuku was already moving toward the robot. There, Aizawa said, pointing a bandaged finger at the screen. Right before the burst of speed. He injures himself. He switched the feed to another incident. Izuku tripping, scraping his knee. Again, a fractional video stutter, and then 2 robots that had been several feet apart were suddenly colliding. Another clip. A quick, hidden movement near his leg, and a rock that had been on the ground was suddenly in the air, flying toward a robot's head. It happens every time, Aizawa concluded, his voice flat. A self-inflicted injury, followed by an impossible result. He's not moving fast. He's doing something to the localized flow of time, and the trigger is his own blood. A silence fell over the room, thick and heavy. All Might, in his skeletal form, stood in the corner, his face grim. He knew the boy was quirkless. Or at least, he had been. Had a quirk manifested this late? And one so cruel? My word, said Recovery Girl, her usual chipper demeanor gone, replaced by a deep, professional horror. She stared at the screen, where the final footage showed Izuku leaning against the wall, pale and bleeding from a dozen small wounds, to require self-harm for activation. The physical toll is one thing, but the psychological implications. That's not a quirk for a hero. It's a pathway to self-destruction. The boy is a walking trauma case. President Mike was uncharacteristically quiet. So, his score. Villain points 0, Niza said calmly, though a flicker of intense curiosity shone in his black eyes. He pressed another button. However, a new column appeared on the screen next to Izuku's name. Rescue points. The number began to climb rapidly. 10. 20. 25 for saving an examinee from a confirmed kill shot from a 3-pointer. 45 for the zero-pointer incident, saving another examinee from certain death and disabling the obstacle. The final tally settled. Rescue points, 60. It was the highest rescue score any of them had ever seen. 60 rescue points. All Might whispered, a mixture of pride, shock, and profound dread churning in his gut. Aizawa stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. He saw the score. He saw the path of injury and pain the boy had carved for himself to earn it. He saw a child who had learned that his own suffering was a commodity, a resource to be spent in the service of others. He passed, Aizawa said, his voice devoid of any warmth. But if he thinks he can get through my class by tearing himself apart piece by piece, he's got another thing coming. The boy had the heart of a true hero. But Aizawa feared, with a cold certainty, that the price of that heroism would be a cost no child should ever have to pay. The acceptance letter from Yue hadn't felt like a key unlocking a golden door. It felt like a bill coming due. For 10 months, Izuku had paid the toll for his dream in secret, in drops and trickles of his own blood. Now, standing in his bedroom, the crisp new uniform hanging on his door felt less like a costume and more like a shroud. It was the uniform of a hero, but to him, it was the uniform of a boy who had learned to commodify his own pain. His morning routine had changed. It no longer ended with tying his red sneakers. Now, there was a final, grim ritual. He sat on the edge of his bed and opened a small, unassuming black case, the kind meant for carrying drafting tools. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, were not pens and pencils, but his instruments. A half-dozen sterile, full-wrap scalpel blades. A roll of professional-grade medical tape. Antiseptic wipes. A small tube of coagulant gel for emergencies. It was the toolkit of a field medic, but he was both the medic and the casualty. He slipped a single blade and a few wipes into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of his school blazer. He was armed. Izuku, you're going to be late. His mother's voice called from the kitchen, brimming with an unadulterated joy that twisted a knot of guilt in his stomach. He walked into the kitchen, and Inko Midoriya's eyes welled up instantly. Seeing her son, her small, once fragile Izuku, standing tall in the prestigious uniform of Yue, high was the culmination of 1,000 prayers she thought had gone unanswered. Oh, Izuku, she sniffled, dabbing her eyes with a dish towel. You look so heroic. The word landed like a physical blow. Heroic. He forced a smile that fell brittle enough to shatter. Thanks, Mom. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to confess the terrible truth of his quirk, to let her comfort him, to let her tell him to stop. But he couldn't. The pride in her eyes was a fragile, beautiful thing, and he knew his secret would obliterate it. It was better for her to believe he was simply a late bloomer, a boy whose dream had, by some miracle, come true. The lie was its own kind of wound, a deep, internal bleed that no bandage could staunch. The walk to Yue was surreal. He was one of them now. He walked among students with wings, with tails, with skin made of rock. Their quirks were a part of them, as natural as their hair color. His was a parasite, a demon he had to bargain with, feeding it pieces of himself in exchange for power. He felt like a spy, a foreign agent deep in enemy territory. He found Class 1A, the massive door, a clear statement of Yue's larger-than-life ethos. Taking a breath that did little to calm the frantic hummingbird in his chest, he slid it open. He was immediately met with the sight of the stern, blue-haired boy from the entrance exam, Ida Tenya, locked in a fierce debate with Bakugo, whose feet were propped disrespectfully on his desk. Take your feet off that desk, Ida commanded, his arms chopping the air with mechanical precision. You are defiling the sacred workspace of our upperclassmen. Like I care what a bunch of old fossils think, Bakugo sneered, not even bothering to look at him. His crimson eyes scanned the room and then landed on Izuku, freezing in the doorway. Bakugo's sneer vanished, replaced by a look of sharp, predatory confusion. The look a wolf might give a sheep that had somehow learned to bite. It's you, a cheerful voice said, and Izuku turned to see the round-faced girl from the exam. Ochako Uraraka. You got in. That was amazing, what you did with the zero-pointer. And then you just disappeared. Izuku's face flushed. Oh. Thanks. I just did what anyone would do. He rubbed the back of his neck, his fingers tracing the faint, phantom line of a scar he knew was no longer there, thanks to the paramedics' work. "If you're here to make friends, you can leave." The voice was a low, tired drawl that seemed to suck the energy out of the room. Izuku and the others turned to see a man lying on the floor behind the teacher's podium, cocooned in a yellow sleeping bag like a miserable caterpillar. He took a long sip from a juice pouch before unzipping himself and rising to his feet. He had the exhausted, bloodshot eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss and found it boring. "I'm your homeroom teacher, Shota Aizawa," he said, his voice flat. "It took you 8 seconds to quiet down. That's not going to work. Time is a precious resource." Aizawa's eyes swept across the class, lingering for a fraction of a second longer on Izuku. It was a look of cold, clinical assessment, and Izuku felt a shiver of dread. This man saw more than the others. "Put these on," Aizawa said, tossing a bundle of UA gym uniforms onto his desk. "Meet me on the training grounds." The sun beat down on the athletic field. The air was thick with nervous energy. The other students were buzzing, speculating about the opening ceremony, the school tour, the guidance counselor session. Aizawa shattered their expectations with a single sentence. "We're having a Quirk apprehension test." A chorus of protests erupted. "But what about orientation?" Uraraka cried out. "Yui isn't a normal school," Aizawa countered, his gaze sweeping over them, silencing the chatter. "We're not bound by standard educational practices. Here, you have 3 years to become a hero. You think you have time for frivolous ceremonies?" He turned his unsettling gaze directly to one student. "Bakugo. You got the top score in the practical exam. What was your best softball throw in middle school?" 67 meters, Bakugo grunted. "Try it with your Quirk." Bakugo stepped into the circle, a feral grin spreading across his face. He wound up, and with a thunderous explosion that blasted a shockwave across the field, he launched the ball. "Die!" he screamed, the word more a release of pure aggression than a coherent thought. The ball soared, a tiny speck against the blue sky. Aizawa held up a small device. 705.2 meters. The class erupted in whispers of awe. "This looks fun!" Someone cheered. "Fun?" Aizawa's voice dropped, and the temperature seemed to plummet with it. "You think this is fun? So be it. The student who ranks last in these 8 tests will be judged to have no potential, and will be expelled immediately." Panic ripped through the class. For Izuku, the word expelled was a guillotine. He had bled for this. He had scarred himself to earn a place here. To be thrown out on the first day for having no potential was a fate worse than any physical pain. He had to perform. He had to pay the price. The first test was the 50-meter dash. Izuku was paired with Ida. The starting pistol fired. Ida's engines roared to life, and he was gone in a blur. Izuku knew his own physical limits. Without his Quirk, he'd be one of the slowest. He couldn't afford that. As he got into his starting position, he subtly shifted his weight. His right hand, hidden from Aizawa's direct line of sight, moved to his thigh. His fingers found the small, hard outline of the scalpel blade through the thin fabric of his gym shorts. It was a risk. A huge risk. But expulsion was a bigger one. The starting pistol fired. In the fraction of a second before he launched, he pressed the blade's edge against his own skin. A quick, sharp drag. A familiar line of fire. A gush of heat. The world went silent and gray. The gunshot was a frozen puff of smoke. Ida was a statue, leaning forward, his calves blazing with still, blue fire. Izuku had maybe a second. 2 at most. It was a shallow cut. He didn't run. He exploded. He pumped his arms and legs, his body a well-oiled machine from his training, covering nearly half the distance in the frozen time. The dizziness hit. The world crashed back. Sound and color slammed into him. He was suddenly running at full tilt, the world moving around him again. He crossed the finish line a fraction of a second after Ida, his time recorded as 4.13 seconds. A respectable, but not superhuman time. He stumbled to a stop, his leg throbbing, his heart pounding from the temporal whiplash. He saw Uraraka and Ida staring at him with wide, confused eyes. They'd seen him start, and then he was just further ahead than he should have been. It was like he'd teleported 10 meters down the track. He risked a glance at Aizawa. The teacher's face was unreadable, but his dark eyes were narrowed, fixed on Izuku with an unnerving intensity. He'd seen something. Izuku knew it. The grip strength test came and went, his score pathetically average. The standing long jump was the same. He cleared the sandbox, but just barely. He couldn't use his quirk for everything. Each use was a calculated risk, a drain on his physical and mental resources. He had to choose his moments. Then came the ball throw. He watched as his classmates showcased their powers. Uraraka, with a light touch, sent the ball sailing into the stratosphere, her score reading as a simple, elegant infinity symbol. The pressure mounted. This was his chance to prove himself, to score high enough to avoid last place. Midoriya. You're up. He walked into the circle, the small, hard ball feeling unnaturally heavy in his hand. The entire class was watching. Bakugo was staring holes into him, his face a thunderous mask of suspicion. Aizawa's gaze was like a physical weight. Izuku took a deep breath. A shallow cup wouldn't be enough. The sprint had required a burst of motion. This required precision. This required time. He turned his back slightly to the class as he began his wind-up, a classic pitcher's motion he practiced in his room. It was all a feint. The real action was happening in his other hand. He palmed the scalpel blade, its cold, flat steel a familiar comfort against his skin. As his throwing arm swung back, his left hand came up to his right shoulder, as if to steady himself. It was a natural-looking motion. No one would suspect. His fingers curled, pressing the blade deep into the meat of his throwing hand's palm. Pain. White-hot and blinding. He grunted, a sound that was hopefully lost in the exertion of his throw. Blood, hot and copious, flooded his palm, slicking his grip on the ball. The instant the blood flowed, the world ceased to be. Silence. Utter and complete. The ball left his hand and began its ascent, but it was moving in slow motion, a product of his own momentum in the instant before the freeze. He stood in the silent, gray world, his arm outstretched, the blood a shocking, vivid crimson river running down his wrist. He had time now. Precious seconds bought with a deep, deliberate wound. He looked at the ball, hanging at the apex of its arc, 100 feet away. It was a perfect, suspended sphere. The world was his laboratory, and he was the sole researcher. He could see the slight off-center spin he'd put on it, the way the air currents, now frozen, would have dragged it down. It wasn't about adding more power. He couldn't do that. His quirk didn't grant him strength. It granted him control. With a clinical detachment born of necessity, he began to work. He shifted his weight, moving his feet on the ground to adjust the angle of his body. He twisted his torso, ever so slightly. He followed through with his arm, his fingers spread just so, mimicking the perfect release. He was not throwing the ball. He was retroactively perfecting the throw he had already made, manipulating his own body's physics to alter the outcome. It was an act of impossible, temporal choreography. The dizziness was coming on fast. The world at the edge of his vision began to fray, turning dark. The cut was deep. He was losing too much, too quickly. He had to let go. He willed the time to resume. With a nauseating lurch, the universe snapped back into place. The ball, now imbued with the perfected physics of his frozen time adjustments, continued its arc. It flew straight and true, with none of the wobble or drift of a normal throw. It landed far down the field with a soft thud. Aizawa held up the device. 705.3 meters. A collective gasp went through the class. It was 1/10 of a meter farther than Bakugo's. It wasn't an explosive, overwhelming display of power. It was just perfect. Impossibly, unnervingly perfect. What the hell? Someone whispered. Izuku swayed on his feet, his vision swimming. He brought his right hand down, trying to hide it, but it was too late. Blood, dark and undeniable, dripped from his fingertips, splattering onto the dusty ground at his feet. 1 drop. 2. 3. The class fell silent. They had all seen it. The impossible throw. The bleeding hand. The connection was unavoidable. DKU. The roar was pure, undiluted rage. Bakugo stomped towards him, his palms already crackling with tiny explosions. What the hell was that, you damn nerd? You've been lying to me. What is your quirk? He grabbed the front of Izuku's gym uniform. You think hurting yourself makes you strong? You think bleeding all over the place makes you a hero? It's disgusting. You're still just a pathetic, useless Deku. Before Bakugo could unleash an explosion, gray bindings shot out, wrapping around him and neutralizing his quirk. Stand down, Aizawa said, his own eyes now glowing a faint red. Stop acting like a child. Bakugo struggled, but the capture weapon was like steel. He was forced to watch as Izuku stumbled out of the circle, clutching his hand, his face deathly pale. The other students stared, a mixture of awe, fear, and revulsion on their faces. He was no longer just a quiet, mumbled kid. He was something strange and frightening. He was the boy who bled to win. The rest of the tests passed in a blur of pain and humiliation. Izuku wrapped his hand crudely with a strip of cloth he tore from the bottom of his shirt, but the damage was done. He had secured his place, finishing well above the bottom, but he had exposed himself in the process. As the class was dismissed to change, Aizawa's voice cut through the noise. Midoriya. Stay behind. The other students filed away, casting nervous, curious glances back at him. Izuku stood alone on the field, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Aizawa walked over, his expression as grim as a winter sky. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet intensity was more intimidating than any shouting. Let me see your hand, he commanded. Trembling, Izuku held out his hand. Aizawa took it gently, his touch surprisingly careful as he unwrapped the blood-soaked fabric. He examined the clean, deep incision on Izuku's palm with the eyes of an experienced field operative. This wasn't an accident, Aizawa stated, his voice flat. This wasn't from the ball. This was a blade. Your own. Izuku couldn't speak. He could only nod, his eyes fixed on the ground. Your quirk requires self-harm to activate, doesn't it, Midoriya? The directness of the question was a physical blow. There was no room for evasion, no space for a lie. The secret he had guarded so carefully, so violently, was laid bare. Yes, Izuku whispered, the word tasting of shame and defeat. It stops time. But only while I'm actively bleeding. Aizawa let go of his hand and sighed, a long, weary sound. I thought as much. The temporal distortion on the camera feeds from the exam was a giveaway. He looked at Izuku, and for the first time, there was something other than cold assessment in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was a grave, profound concern. Listen to me, and listen carefully, because I will only say this once. That is not a hero's quirk. That is a liability. It's a crutch made of broken glass. Every time you use it, you damage your most valuable piece of equipment, your own body. You make yourself weaker. You open yourself up to infection, to shock, to bleeding out on the battlefield before a villain even lays a hand on you. He took a step closer, his voice dropping lower. What you're doing is not sustainable. You can't build a career on self-mutilation. You'll either be crippled by the cumulative damage, or you'll develop a psychological dependency on pain that will destroy your mind long before your body gives out. You think you're being heroic, making a sacrifice. You're not. You're being reckless. And reckless heroes get themselves and others killed. He stared at Izuku, letting the words sink in. I'm not expelling you today, Midoriya. You have potential. But if you cannot find a way to use your power without tearing yourself to shreds, a way to be rational and strategic instead of just sacrificial, then you have no future here. You'll be a casualty before you even graduate. Now go to Recovery Girl. She needs to see this. Aizawa turned and walked away, leaving Izuku standing alone in the center of the field, the weight of his teacher's words crushing him. The walk to the nurse's office was the longest walk of Izuku's life. Every step was a fresh wave of shame. He had been seen. He had been understood. And he had been judged. Recovery Girl's office was bright and cheerful, a stark contrast to the darkness swirling in Izuku's mind. The diminutive hero was at her desk, stamping papers. She looked up as he entered, her usual sunny smile faltering as she saw his pale face and the bloody rag clutched in his hand. Oh, my dear boy, she said, her voice soft. Aizawa called ahead. Come, sit. Let's have a look at you. He sat on the edge of an examination cot as she gently took his hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her expert eyes scanned the wound, taking in its depth, its clean edges. Her expression hardened. This was deliberate, she said, her voice losing its grandmotherly warmth, replaced by the sharp edge of a seasoned medical professional. This was not a training accident. Izuku could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. Recovery girl finished cleaning the wound with an efficiency that spoke of decades of experience. Then she leaned back, her hands on her hips, and fixed him with a look that was a potent cocktail of fury and profound sorrow. "Do you have any idea what you are doing to yourself?" she began, her voice quivering with restrained emotion. "I have spent 50 years patching up heroes. I have mended broken bones, healed third-degree burns, stitched up wounds that would have killed a normal man. I have dedicated my life to putting heroes back together so they can go out and save people." She took a step closer, her small stature belying the immense force of her presence. "And then you walk in here. A child, with a quirk that asks him to break himself. You see this power as a gift, don't you? A tool to achieve your dream. But I see it for what it is, a curse." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of anger and pity. "A hero's job is to save others, not to destroy yourself in the process, you foolish boy. What good is a hero who bleeds out in an alleyway before help can arrive? What hope can you offer people if you treat your own life as disposable? Every cut you make, every drop of blood you spill by choice, you are telling yourself that you are worth less than the mission. And that is a lie that will rot you from the inside out." She leaned forward, her face inches from his, and delivered the final, devastating blow. "You want to be like All Might? All Might inspires people because he stands tall, because he endures. He is a pillar. You are turning yourself into a sandcastle, letting the tide wash you away piece by piece." She straightened up, took a deep breath, and her professional demeanor returned, though her eyes remained sorrowful. "This will require a lot of your stamina." She leaned in and gave his hand a soft kiss. He felt her quirk activate, the familiar, rapid knitting of flesh and bone. But this time, it felt different. It was accompanied by a wave of crushing fatigue, pulling at his already drained reserves. The skin on his palm stitched itself together, leaving behind smooth, unblemished skin, but he felt as though he'd just run a marathon. The physical wound was gone, but the phantom ache remained, a ghost of the price he had paid. He left the nurse's office, his body healed but his spirit in tatters. He looked at his hand, so clean and perfect, and yet he could still feel the phantom sensation of the blade, the hot rush of blood. He had passed the test. He had avoided expulsion. He was officially a student of UA's hero course, but for the first time, standing in the hallowed halls of his dream school, Izuku Midoriya felt utterly and completely alone, a boy with a terrible secret, standing under the harsh, unforgiving light of scrutiny. The scars were on the inside now, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were the ones that would be the hardest to heal. The bus ride to their off-campus training facility was a cacophony of teenage energy. It was a rolling metal tube filled with the kind of bright, uncomplicated optimism that Izuku felt he had permanently forfeited. He sat crammed between the window and Ida Tenya, who was meticulously reviewing a printed-out schedule for the day's exercise. On his other side, Ochako Uraraka was practically vibrating with excitement. "I can't wait to see what it is," she chirped. "A secret location, rescue training, it's all so heroic." "Indeed," Ida agreed, pushing his glasses up his nose. "UA's curriculum is designed to provide us with practical, real-world experience. It is our duty as students to approach this exercise with the utmost seriousness." Izuku offered a small, watery smile, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Seriousness was not his problem. He had been living in a state of hyper-seriousness for 10 months, a state where every paper cut was a potential resource and every minor stumble a tactical consideration. The weight of Aizawa's and Recovery Girl's words still sat heavy on his soul. A crutch made of broken glass. A sandcastle letting the tide wash it away. He had spent the last 2 weeks trying to be normal, focusing on his academics, participating in class discussions without having to calculate the cost in blood. It was exhausting. "Hey, Midoriya," a voice cut through his thoughts, and he jumped. It was Tsuyu Azuri, her large, expressive eyes fixed on him from the seat across the aisle. Kirishima Aijiro, sitting next to her, leaned forward with a sharp-toothed, friendly grin. "We were just talking about your quirk from the apprehension test," Kirishima said, his tone one of genuine admiration. "That ball throw was so manly. It wasn't flashy like Bakugo's, but it was just solid. So what's the deal? Is it like a super precision thing?" Izuku's blood ran cold. The direct question, posed so innocently, felt like an accusation. His mind raced for a plausible lie, a half-truth, anything. "Well, your quirk is pretty strange, Midoriya," Tsuyu added, her typical bluntness a dagger to his composure. She tapped a finger to her chin. "It reminds me of All Might's in some ways, but it also seems to really hurt you." Kero. The entire bus seemed to quiet down. Bakugo, who had been pointedly ignoring everyone, stiffened in his seat, his gaze fixed on the back of the headrest in front of him. He knew part of the truth, and the part he didn't know seemed to infuriate him more than anything. It's complicated," Izuku stammered, his face flushing a deep crimson. "It's a stockpiling type of quirk, so when I use it, there's a lot of backlash. My body isn't used to it yet. I'm still trying to figure out how to control it without, you know." He gestured vaguely at his arm, the phantom ache of the scalpel cut flaring up in his memory. It was a flimsy, pathetic lie, piggybacking on the logic All Might had provided for the inevitable questions about One for All. But it was the only shield he had. A quirk that requires conditioning, a classic high-risk, high-reward type. Ida declared, unknowingly providing Izuku with a much-needed escape route. "You must be very diligent with your training, Midoriya." Izuku just nodded, sinking into his seat and turning back to the window, the conversation leaving a sour taste in his mouth. Every word was a careful dance around a horrifying secret. He was a fraud, wrapped in a lie, sitting amongst true, honest-to-God heroes in training. The bus arrived at a massive, domed structure. The Unforeseen Simulation Joint, or USJ. Inside, the sheer scale of the facility was breathtaking. It was a self-contained world of disaster scenarios, a shipwreck zone, a landslide area, a sprawling plaza, a conflagration zone, all meticulously crafted. Waiting for them was the space hero, 13, their suit bulky and astronaut-like. 13's speech began with an enthusiastic overview of their quirk, Black Hole, and its applications in rescue scenarios. But the hero's tone shifted, growing more somber. "As you know, my quirk can be used to save people by clearing away rubble and debris," 13 said, holding up a single finger. "But it is also a power that can be used to kill. It can tear people apart easily. I have no doubt that some of you possess similar quirks." Izuku's hands clenched into fists. He thought of his scalpel, of the grim satisfaction of a clean cut, of the silent, gray world that followed. He thought of Aizawa's warning, "Reckless heroes get themselves and others killed." "In our superhuman society," 13 continued, "the line between heroism and villainy is a thin one. A single misstep, a moment of lost control, and your power to save can become a power to destroy. This class is not just about learning to use your quirks. It is about learning to control them. It's about understanding the awesome, terrible responsibility you carry. It is about learning how to save lives." The words resonated deep within Izuku's core. To save lives. That was the goal. That was the only thing that made the cost bearable. Suddenly, the lights in the facility flickered and died. The central water fountain sputtered and went still. A dark, swirling vortex of purple and black mist opened in the center of the plaza, an ugly wound in the fabric of space. From its depths, a figure emerged, a man covered in dismembered hands, his pale hair a shock of white against the grim purple portal. Then more came. Dozens of them. Villains, low-level thugs, monstrous brutes, all pouring into the facility with a quiet, predatory confidence. "Stay back!" Aizawa barked, his usual lethargy gone, replaced by the sharp, cold focus of a veteran pro. He pulled his yellow goggles over his eyes. "This is real." 13. Protect the students. As Aizawa leaped down the stairs, a one-man army against a tide of villains, the purple mist swirled up before the students, coalescing into a towering, articulate being. "Greetings," the creature's voice echoed, smooth and chilling. We are the League of Villains. We have taken the liberty of inviting ourselves into this bastion of heroism. Our objective? To kill the symbol of peace, All Might. Before anyone could react, the mist expanded, engulfing them. Izuku felt a terrifying sensation of being pulled apart, a violent, disorienting trip through a non-space that twisted his stomach. He squeezed his eyes shut. When the feeling stopped, he wasn't on the stairs anymore. He was falling. He hit the water with a jarring splash. Cold shocked his system. He thrashed, his head breaking the surface, gasping for air. He was in the shipwreck zone. The massive boat, the centerpiece of the area, loomed over him. He wasn't alone. A few feet away, Tsuyu's head popped up, her expression calm and analytical. Then, with a high-pitched scream, Mineta surfaced, flailing wildly. We're gonna die! The small boy shrieked, tears and water streaming down his face. Calm down, Mineta-chan, Tsuyu said, her voice steady. We need to assess the situation. The assessment was grim. The water around them was churning. Villains, their quirks clearly adapted for aquatic combat, were closing in. One had the head of a shark, another propelled himself with jets of water from his hands, a third had long, sucker-covered tentacles. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and in an environment that heavily favored their opponents. They must have known the class schedule, Izuku muttered, treading water, his mind kicking into its familiar analytical mode. They knew All Might was supposed to be here. This was a targeted attack. They probably scattered us to pick us off one by one, Tsuyu added. They don't know our quirks, which gives us a slight advantage. An advantage? Look at them. Mineta wailed. We're fish in a barrel. He was right. They were in serious trouble. Izuku looked at the villains closing in, their leering faces promising a world of pain. A small cut, a pinprick, might buy him a second or two, enough to dodge a single attack, maybe. But it wouldn't be enough to save all three of them. It wouldn't be enough to formulate and execute a plan. He needed more. He needed time. Aizawa's face flashed in his mind. You can't build a career on self-mutilation. Recovery Girl's voice echoed after it. You are turning yourself into a sandcastle. He looked at Tsuyu's determined face, at Mineta's terrified one. 13's words returned. Learning how to save lives. The choice was no choice at all. This wasn't a test. This wasn't for a grade. This was life and death. He had to use his quirk, and he had to use it decisively. But how? He couldn't just stop in the middle of a battle and pull out a scalpel. It had to be part of the fight. An opportunity. A villain with a shark-like mutation, all jagged teeth and dead eyes, lunged at them. Time to see what you hero brats are made of, he snarled, his powerful tail propelling him through the water at an incredible speed. Tsuyu shot her tongue out, wrapping it around Mineta and pulling him out of the direct path. But the move left Izuku exposed. This was it. The opportunity. A terrible, bloody door opening for him. He didn't try to dodge. He steeled himself, his muscles tensing. The shark man swiped at him, not with his fists, but with a fin on his forearm that was as sharp and rigid as a blade. Izuku twisted his body, presenting his side. It was a calculated risk, a horrifying bargain made in a split second. He felt a searing, tearing pain along his ribs. It was a messy, brutal wound, nothing like the clean incisions he was used to. The cold water of the USJ flooded the gash, stealing his breath and sending a shockwave of agony through his entire body. He felt the hot, immediate rush of his own blood dispersing into the water around him, a cloud of crimson in the murky blue. And in that instant of supreme agony, the world obeyed its master. The silence was a physical blow. The churning water became a solid, textured mass of gray. The shark villain was frozen mid-swipe, a look of savage glee locked on his face. Tsuyu was a statue of coiled tension, her tongue still extended. Mineta was a perfect sculpture of shrieking terror. The water jets from another villain were crystalline pillars, and the bubbles rising from their lungs were a string of suspended pearls. Izuku floated in the dead center of the silent chaos. His only sensations were the profound, deafening quiet and the rhythmic, fiery throb in his side. He looked down. The cloud of his blood hung in the water, a beautiful, terrible nebula. The gash was deep. deeper than he'd intended. He had time. More time than he'd ever had before. 30, maybe 40 seconds. A lifetime. The cold was starting to seep in, a deep, dangerous chill that had nothing to do with the water temperature. It was the chill of shock, of significant blood loss. The clock was ticking. First, secure your allies. He swam through the thick, unmoving water. It was like moving through gelatin. He reached Tsuyu and Mineta. They were heavy, inert, like waterlogged dolls. He grunted with the effort, his wounded side screaming in protest, and pushed them toward the edge of the massive boat, out of the immediate ring of villains. Second, neutralize the threats. He turned his attention to the dozen villains frozen in the water. He couldn't fight them. He was injured, and he had no offensive power. But he was a strategist. He was the ghost in their machine. He swam to the villain with the water jet hands. The man was aiming at the spot where they had been. Izuku grabbed his arms and painstakingly twisted his torso, re-aiming his frozen hands directly at the back of the shark man's head. He moved to another villain, a hulking brute who was winding up for a punch. Izuku grabbed the man's massive fist and, with all his strength, moved it so it was lined up perfectly with the jaw of a smaller, eel-like villain next to him. He swam from villain to villain, a grim choreographer of a ballet of self-destruction. He didn't have to defeat them. He just had to make them defeat each other. His movements were frantic, desperate. The dizziness was growing stronger, black spots dancing at the edges of his vision. He saw two villains standing near the edge of the boat, their legs dangling in the water. An idea, absurd and brilliant, struck him. He swam over, his hands fumbling with their wet, baggy pants. He found their shoelaces. With numb, clumsy fingers, he tied the left lace of one villain to the right lace of the other. It was a detail born of his own bullied past, a touch of playground cruelty turned into a tactical weapon. Third, the exit strategy. He swam back to the boat, his strength failing. The world was starting to feel fuzzy, the silence less peaceful and more like the prelude to fainting. He looked at Tsuyu and Mineta. He needed to get them off the boat. He saw the purple spheres on Mineta's head and thought of Tsuyu's long, powerful tongue. He couldn't explain the plan in the frozen time. He could only set the stage. He moved Mineta closer to the edge, positioning him for a throw. He moved Tsuyu so she was poised to use her tongue. The cold was becoming unbearable. His body was screaming at him, demanding he stop the bleeding, demanding he rest. The 40 seconds felt like 40 minutes. It was time. He couldn't hold it any longer. He let go. The universe slammed back into place with a deafening roar. The water jet villain's Quirk erupted, blasting the shark man in the back of the head, and sending him face first into the boat's hull with a sickening crunch. The brute's punch, now re-aimed, connected squarely with the eel man's jaw, knocking him unconscious. The two villains with their laces tied together, surprised by the sudden chaos, tried to move apart, tripped, and tumbled into the water with a shared cry of alarm. The entire circle of villains descended into a confused, painful brawl, just as Izuku had planned. "What's happening?" Mineta shrieked, looking at the chaos. "No time! We have to go!" Izuku gasped, his voice thin and reedy. He pressed a hand to his bleeding side, his gym uniform stained a dark, spreading crimson. "Mineta, your Quirk, throw your spheres into the water. As many as you can. Ribbit? Midoriya-chan, you're bleeding," Tsuyu said, her eyes wide with alarm. "Please! Just do it!" he urged. Hesitantly, Mineta started pulling the sticky purple balls from his head and flinging them into the water, where they floated. "Tsuyu," Izuku said, his voice barely a whisper. "Your tongue, can you wrap it around all three of us and jump to the center of those spheres?" Understanding dawned on her face. "It'll be a stretch, but I can do it. Hold on tight." Her tongue shot out, a pink, powerful rope, wrapping around his and Mineta's waists. With a mighty leap, she launched them from the boat, landing them squarely in the buoyant cluster of Mineta's spheres, creating a makeshift raft. They had escaped. Tsuyu looked at him, her usual calm expression replaced with deep concern. "Your side, that villain did that to you. But how did you?" She trailed off, looking back at the villains who had so conveniently taken each other out. It didn't make sense. Izuku couldn't answer. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering. The world was tilting on its axis. He could only watch from his strange, purple raft as the scene at the center of the USJ played out, and what he saw made the blood freeze in his veins. Aizawa was down. The man who had dispatched dozens of villains with terrifying efficiency was on the ground, his arm trapped beneath a monster. This Nomu, as the hand-covered man called it, was a grotesque parody of a man, its muscles bulging unnaturally, its brain exposed, its eyes vacant and dead. It held Aizawa's arm, and with a sickening crunch that echoed across the plaza, it broke it. Aizawa didn't scream. He grit his teeth, his quirk flaring to erase the power of the man with the hands, Shigaraki. But the Nomu was a different beast. It was pure, raw physical power. It slammed Aizawa's head into the concrete, again and again. It's no good, eraserhead, Shigaraki rasped, scratching his neck with a frantic, itchy motion. He's the anti-symbol of peace, the bioengineered warrior, Nomu. And he's going to kill you. Izuku watched, helpless, his heart a block of ice. Aizawa, his stern, demanding teacher who had warned him about the price of recklessness, was being murdered. You know, Shigaraki mused, walking slowly toward the downed hero. I'm disappointed. Where is All Might? We went to all this trouble, and he doesn't even bother to show up. Maybe if I kill a few of his students, he'll deign to make an appearance. He looked up, his crazed red eye visible through a gap in the hand on his face, and seemed to look right at them. He turned back to Aizawa. The Noma held him down, helpless. Let's make an example of the teacher first, Shigaraki said, a chilling glee in his voice. He reached down, his 5 fingers spread, aiming for Aizawa's face. Izuku knew that quirk. He had seen the dust it left behind. Disintegration. One touch, and Aizawa would be gone. There was no time. No time for a plan, no time for a clean cut. He was already weak, already bleeding. Another major wound might kill him. But he couldn't just watch. He couldn't. He scrambled off the makeshift raft, ignoring Tsuyu's cry of protest. He landed on the edge of the plaza, his legs trembling. He needed a burst. Just a few seconds. A desperate final gamble. His eyes darted around and found a piece of rubble, a sharp-edged piece of concrete from where the Nomu had shattered the ground. Pain was the trigger. Blood was the fuel. It didn't have to be a cut. He stumbled over to the rock. He didn't hesitate. He slammed his left hand down onto the sharp edge, putting all of his weight behind it. He wasn't aiming for the flesh. He was aiming for the bone. A sickening, wet crack echoed in his own ears, followed by an explosion of agony so white-hot and absolute it dwarfed the gash in his side. He screamed, a raw, ragged sound. His pinky and ring finger were bent at an obscene angle. Shards of bone had broken the skin. A fresh, new torrent of blood, mixed with the sharp sting of marrow, gushed from his mangled hand. The world shattered into silence. This time stop was different. It was frantic, desperate, fueled by pure, unadulterated agony. The gray world seemed to vibrate with the echo of his pain. He had maybe 3 seconds. 4 at the most. Shigaraki's hand was frozen, inches from Aizawa's face. The Nomu was a mountain of impassive, still muscle. Izuku ran. He was a green thunderbolt in a dead world. His feet pounded on the concrete, his broken hand held tight to his chest, his side a fiery torment. He didn't think. He only acted. He was pure, desperate instinct. He reached Aizawa's side. He didn't have the strength to fight the Nomu, even a frozen one. But he didn't need to. He just needed to move the target. He grabbed the collar of Aizawa's costume, his fingers clumsy and slick with his own blood. He pulled. He pulled with every ounce of strength he had left, with the force of his 10 months of training, with the sheer, desperate will to save his teacher. Aizawa's body slid a few feet across the concrete, his head moving out from under Shigaraki's descending hand. Izuku's vision went black. The pain, the blood loss, the sheer exertion, it was too much. He felt himself falling as the world roared back to life. Shigaraki's hand slammed into the spot where Aizawa's face had been, his quirk turning the concrete to a cloud of fine gray dust. He looked up, his eye wide with confusion and fury. What? Where did you? He never finished the sentence. Boom. The doors to the USJ were blasted off their hinges, sent flying inward by an impossible force. A figure stood in the entrance, silhouetted against the bright sunlight. He wasn't smiling. His face was a mask of cold, righteous fury. "Have no fear," All Might said, his voice a low, rumbling thunder that promised retribution. "For I am here." Izuku lay on the ground, his consciousness flickering like a dying candle. He saw All Might move in a blur, dispatching the low-level villains, snatching Aizawa's unconscious form, and moving him to safety with Tsuyu and Mineta. He saw the epic, earth-shattering confrontation between All Might and the Nomu, a battle of gods that shook the very foundations of the building. But it was all happening at a distance, seen through a darkening tunnel. He could feel Tsuyu's cool hand on his forehead, hear Mineta's terrified sobs. He had done it. He had bought them time. He had bought Aizawa time. He had bought All Might time. He looked at his mangled, broken hand, at the dark stains spreading across his side. He had paid the price. As the darkness finally consumed him, his last coherent thought was a simple, chilling question. Was it enough? The world returned to Izuku Midoriya in muted fragments. The first was the smell, a sterile, antiseptic sharpness that clawed at the edges of his consciousness. The second was sound, the rhythmic, metronomic beep of a heart monitor, a stark contrast to the profound silence he had come to associate with his own power. The third, and most insistent, was pain, not the sharp, declarative agony of a fresh wound, but a deep, throbbing, full-body ache, a phantom symphony of the trauma his body had endured. His side was a dull fire, his left hand a universe of crushed, grinding agony, and his very blood felt thin and tired in his veins. He forced his eyes open. The ceiling was white, the light a soft, indirect glow. He was in a hospital room. The pristine sheets were tucked tightly around him, and in 4 lines snaked from his arm to a bag of saline and, he noted with a grim, clinical interest, blood. A transfusion. He'd lost that much. "He's awake." The voice was calm and professional. Izuku turned his head slowly, his neck muscles protesting. Detective Naomasa Tsukachi stood by the door, his familiar trench coat and weary expression a fixture of any major villain incident. Beside him stood a doctor in a white coat, holding a chart. "Midoriya-kun," the doctor said, offering a small, tired smile. "Welcome back. You gave us quite a scare. You were brought in with severe blood loss, hypothermic shock, a grade 3 laceration to your left flank, and a comminuted fracture of the 4th and 5th metacarpals of your left hand. You're very lucky." Izuku processed the words like a list of debits. Each injury was a price paid. He looked at his left hand, now encased in a thick, heavy cast. Lucky. The word felt wrong. Luck hadn't saved Aizawa-sensei. Luck hadn't brought All Might. A calculated, desperate sacrifice had. "The villains, my classmates." "Aizawa-sensei?" Izuku's voice was a dry rasp. "Your classmates are all safe," Tsukachi assured him, stepping closer. 13 is recovering from their injuries, but they will be fine. Aizawa-sensei, he sustained heavy injuries, but the doctors say he will make a full recovery. He's a tough man." The detective paused, his gaze searching Izuku's face. "He owes his life to you, son. We've pieced together what we can from the other students' testimony, and the security footage that wasn't destroyed. Shigaraki was about to kill him. And then, in a blink of an eye, he was moved. No one saw how. Just that you were suddenly there, on the ground, having collapsed from your injuries." Tsukachi's quirk, human lie detector, was a subtle thing, but Izuku could feel the weight of its passive scrutiny. He knew he had to stick to the story, the flimsy shield he and All Might had concocted. I don't know." Izuku lied, the words feeling like gravel in his throat. "I just saw he was in trouble, and my quirk, it burst out. It was just a burst of speed. I don't really remember it clearly." A small, internal part of the detective's mind registered the statement as a falsehood, a carefully constructed deception. But he did impress. The boy in the bed was a victim, a child who had fought like a veteran. "Whatever you did, it was an act of incredible bravery. You bought just enough time for All Might to arrive. The official report will commend your quick thinking and heroic instinct." Heroic instinct. The phrase echoed in the sterile room. They were praising the result, ignorant of the horrifying process. They saw a hero. They didn't see the boy who had deliberately shattered his own hand on a piece of concrete. They didn't see the grim calculus that had led to that decision, and in their ignorance, they were validating his path. They were telling him that what he did was right. After the detective and doctor left, the door creaked open again. It was All Might, in his skeletal form, looking smaller and more fragile than ever under the fluorescent lights. He carried a small bag of fruit, which he placed on the bedside table with a quiet thud. He didn't speak for a long time, just stood there, his hollowed-out eyes fixed on Izuku's cast. "I was too late," he finally said, his voice heavy with a guilt that seemed to physically weigh him down. "If I hadn't reached my limit before I got to school, if I had been there from the start, you wouldn't have had to." He gestured vaguely at Izuku's battered form. "I did what I had to do," Izuku said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact. "Young Midoriya." "Izuku." All Might pulled a chair close, his joints creaking. "We need to talk about your quirk. I know what Aizawa-sensei said." Izuku cut in, a defensive edge to his tone. "I know what Recovery Girl thinks. But they don't understand, All Might. It worked. I saved him. At what cost?" All Might countered, his voice pleading. "Look at you. You nearly died. This power of yours, this ability to stop time, it's a siren's song, my boy. It offers you a quick, decisive solution, but the price is your own lifeblood. You cannot continue down this path. That's why I gave you One for All, so you would have a power that builds you up, not one that tears you down." Izuku looked away, staring at the foredrip, watching the clear fluid mix with the dark red of the blood bag. "One for All is your power," he said quietly. This one is mine. It's the quirk I was born with. I just didn't know it." He met All Might's gaze, and his eyes were filled with a terrifying, unshakable conviction. "I can't ignore it. It's a tool, maybe a dangerous one, but it's mine to use. One for All, it's still too much for me. My arm shatters when I use it. My own quirk, it breaks me too, but I can control the breaks. I can choose the price." All Might looked at the boy he had chosen as his successor, and felt a chasm opening between them. He saw a child who had spent a decade feeling powerless, who had just been handed a power that validated his oldest, most deeply held belief, that he had to give up a piece of himself to be worth anything at all. He had found a way to be a hero before One for All was even a factor, and that independent success had given him a sense of ownership that was rapidly curdling into a martyr's pride. "Promise me," All Might said, his voice strained. "Promise me you will focus on mastering One for All. Promise me you will make that your priority." "I'll try, All Might," Izuku said. And the detective's quirk wasn't needed to know that was another carefully chosen deception. Returning to Yue a week later was like walking into his own memorial service while still being alive. He was a ghost haunting the hallways, his cast a stark white symbol of his heroism. The other students treated him with a new, strange mixture of awe and trepidation. In the cafeteria, Kirishima and Kaminari slapped him on the back, gently, near his good shoulder, and lauded his bravery. "Dude, we heard what happened," Kaminari said, his voice buzzing with energy. "Taking on those villains to protect Mr. Aizawa? That's crazy manly, seriously." Kirishima agreed, flexing a hardened arm. "When the chips are down, you're all grit, Midoriya. That's what being a hero is all about." The praise felt like acid. They were celebrating his self-destruction, leonizing the very act that Aizawa had condemned. He mumbled a thank you and quickly found a seat, his appetite gone. Uraraka and Ida sat down with him, their faces etched with genuine, heart-wrenching concern. "Midoriya-kun, are you sure you should be back so soon?" Ida asked, his hands making small, anxious chopping motions. "Your injuries were extensive. You must prioritize your recovery." "He's right, Deku-kun," Uraraka said, her brow furrowed. She looked at his cast, then at his pale face. "You look exhausted. You don't have to push yourself so hard." Their kindness was almost harder to bear than the praise. It was a kindness he felt he didn't deserve, a kindness from people who lived in a different world. Their quirks were extensions of themselves, gifts they had been given. His was a debt collector, and he was perpetually in arrears. How could he explain that to them? How could he make them understand that pushing himself, breaking himself, was the only way he knew how to be useful? "I'm fine," he said, the lie automatic. "Really? The doctor said I'm healing fast. I need to keep up with my studies." He saw the hurt flicker in Uraraka's eyes at his dismissal, the slight rigidity in Ida's posture. He was pushing them away, and he knew it, but it felt necessary. A chasm was opening between him and them, and he was the one digging it. They couldn't understand his burden. Their concern, pure as it was, felt like an anchor, holding him back from the sacrifices he knew he would have to make again. Others were less vocal but more observant. During class, he would feel eyes on him. He'd look up to see Yayorosa watching him, her expression analytical, as if he were a complex equation she couldn't solve. He'd catch Todoroki's heterochromatic gaze, cold and assessing, lingering on his cast before flicking away. They weren't buying the burst of speed story. They were smart. They saw the input, grievous, self-inflicted looking injuries, and the output, impossible, time-bending results, and they knew the two were connected. They saw him not as a hero, but as a dangerous anomaly. He was an acceptable loss to himself, and that made him an unpredictable, and therefore untrustworthy, variable to them. But the isolation was a crucible. It hardened his resolve. In the quiet of his room at night, surrounded by the smiling, triumphant visages of All Might, he began his true work. He had always been a meticulous note-taker, his hero analysis for the future notebooks filled with observations on others. Now, he began a new ledger. It was a simple, black-covered notebook, nondescript. On the first page, he wrote the title in his neat, cramped hand, Chronos Protocol, Asset Expenditure Analysis. It was a catalog of his own body, a user manual for his quirk written in the cold, detached language of a technician. He was the machine, and he was its sole, obsessive engineer. The entries were chilling in their practicality. Entry 1, Upper limbs hands, asset high concentration of small bones, nerve endings. Expenditure, minor laceration, palms/fingers yields 1 to 3 seconds of frozen time. Pain moderate. Recovery fast. Risk low. Ideal for minor repositioning, dodging. Digit fracture, single yields 3 to 5 seconds. Pain high. Recovery slow, requires medical intervention. Risk moderate, loss of dexterity. Use, emergency evasion, short-range ally protection. Crush injury, metacarpals ref USJ yields 5 to 7 seconds. Pain extreme. Recovery, very slow, high probability of long-term damage. Risk high. Use life or death scenarios only. Entry 2, upper limbs forearms. Asset, easily accessible major blood vessels, radial/ulnar arteries. Expenditure, superficial cut across muscle belly yields 5 to 10 seconds. Pain moderate. Risk, low, easily controlled bleed. Primary tactical option. Deep cut, arterial involvement yields 20 to 30 seconds. Pain high. Risk high, rapid blood loss. Requires immediate post-activation pressure. Use, securing objectives, complex environmental manipulation. He would sit for hours, anatomy chart spread out beside him, tracing the blue and red lines of his own circulatory system. He saw himself not as a person, but as a resource. His limbs were batteries. His blood was fuel. Each part of him had a value, a specific amount of time it could purchase. The torso is a high-risk, high-yield area. The carotid and jugular arteries in the neck are an absolute last resort, a self-destruct button. The femoral artery in the thigh, that could buy me a full minute, maybe more. The thought sent a shiver through him that was equal parts terror and morbid curiosity. He was becoming a monster, and his own body was the monster's cage. He saw the looks his classmates gave him, the worry from his teachers, the pity from his mother, and it all just solidified his belief. They didn't understand sacrifice. They were afraid of the cost. But a hero doesn't get to be afraid of the cost. A hero pays the price. This dark knowledge, this secret ledger, it was his alone. It was his burden, and carrying it was, in his mind, the truest form of heroism. He wasn't just willing to break himself for others, he was willing to plan it, to quantify it, to make his own destruction an efficient and tactical weapon. The confrontation, when it came, was not loud. It was not explosive. It was quiet, and that made it 1,000 times more terrifying. It was after school, a few days before the UE Sports Festival was set to begin. The final bell had rung, and the classroom was emptying out in a noisy wave. Izuku was packing his bag, his movements slow and deliberate because of his caste. He was one of the last ones left. Deku. The voice was low, a gravelly rasp. Izuku froze. He didn't have to look. He knew that voice better than his own. He turned to see Katsuki Bakugo standing by the door, blocking his exit. His usual explosive posture was gone. He wasn't sneering. He wasn't crackling with energy. He was just standing there, his hands in his pockets, his red eyes fixed on Izuku with an unnerving, predatory stillness. Keikaken, Izuku stammered, his heart starting to hammer against his ribs. I was just leaving. Stay, Bakugo commanded. The single word was not a request. He shut the classroom door, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden silence. The late afternoon sun streamed through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the empty desks. Bakugo walked slowly toward him, his footsteps unnervingly soft. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning Izuku from head to toe, lingering on the cast, then on the faint, almost invisible scar that peeked out from under his collar from the USJ wound. I saw you, Bakugo said, his voice a low growl. At the USJ. After you did that thing. When you were lying on the ground, bleeding all over the place. Before the teachers got to you. Izuku swallowed hard. I don't know what you're. Shut up, Bakugo cut him off, his voice dangerously soft. Don't lie to me. I've known you my whole damn life. I know when you're lying. He took another step closer, invading Izuku's personal space. You looked satisfied. That's the word. Not scared. Not in pain. You looked like you just won. Like breaking yourself into pieces was the whole point of the game. Izuku's breath hitched. Bakugo's words were too sharp, too close to a truth he hadn't even dared to admit to himself. That's what this is all about, isn't it? Bakugo continued, his voice dripping with a cold, intellectual fury that was far more chilling than his usual explosive rage. This new quirk of yours. It's not about winning. It's not about being a hero. It's about you. It's about making sure everyone sees how much you're suffering. He leaned in, his face inches from Izuku's, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You spent your whole life being the useless, quirkless Deku. The one everyone had to feel sorry for. And you hated it, but you got used to it. You got good at it. And now you've found a way to be a hero and still be the victim. The noble martyr. The one who has to bleed and break and suffer more than anyone else just to keep up. Izuku stared, speechless, his mind reeling. Every word was a perfectly aimed blow, striking at the insecure foundations of his new identity. You enjoy this, don't you? Bakugo hissed, his red eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. He poked Izuku's chest with a single finger, right over his heart. Playing the martyr. You think this makes you a hero? You think this makes you better than me? Because you're willing to tear yourself apart? He scoffed, a bitter, disgusted sound. It's pathetic. It's the most pathetic thing I've ever seen. You're not a hero. You're just taking the one thing you were always good at, being broken, and trying to call it a superpower. This wasn't just bullying. This was a dissection. Bakugo, in his own twisted, arrogant way, was showing the horrifying form of concern. His entire worldview was built on a simple premise: strength equals victory. He had to be the strongest to be the best. Izuku's new reality, where self-inflicted weakness was the key to a bizarre, horrifying form of strength, was anathema to him. It broke the rules of their lifelong rivalry. If Deku could win by destroying himself, it rendered all of Bakugo's efforts, his training, his overwhelming power, completely meaningless. He was attacking Izuku's complex not out of kindness, but to defend the very foundation of his own ambition. You don't understand, Izuku finally managed to whisper, his voice trembling. You don't know what it takes. I know that a hero who wants to die is just a damn villain in waiting, Bakugo snarled. He straightened up, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and something that looked unnervingly like pity. Do whatever you want, Deku. Break every bone in your body. I don't care. But don't you dare pretend you're doing it for anyone but yourself. He turned and walked away, slamming the classroom door open and striding down the empty hall, leaving Izuku alone in the silent, sun-drenched room. Izuku stood there for a long time, his body shaking. Bakugo's words echoed in his mind, a venomous, insistent litany. You enjoy this. Playing the martyr. He stumbled back, leaning against the desk for support, his cast feeling impossibly heavy. He's wrong, Izuku told himself, the thought a desperate mantra. He's wrong. He's always been wrong. He can't understand sacrifice. He only understands power. This is the price. This is what it means to be a hero when you start with nothing, but the seed had been planted. A tiny, poisonous seed of doubt. Was there a part of him that reveled in the shock on people's faces? A part that felt a grim satisfaction in the terrible price his quirk exacted? A part that liked being the tragic, bleeding hero? He shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. No. He was doing what was necessary. Bakugo was just trying to get in his head before the sports festival. That's all it was. He picked up his bag, his jaw clenched with a new, harder resolve. He would show them. He would show all of them. At the sports festival, the whole world would be watching, and he would show them what true heroism, what true sacrifice looked like. That night, he went home, ignored his mother's worried questions, and locked himself in his room. He took out the black notebook. He stared at the last entry for a moment, then opened to a fresh page. With a hand that was now steady, he wrote a new heading, Sports Festival, Potential Expenditure Scenarios. He was not a martyr. He was a strategist. And he would use every last drop of his own blood to prove it.